China defends multilateralism and free trade at the United Nations. We will take a look at Chinese State Councilor Wang Yi's speech at the General Assembly. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi addressed the United Nations General Assembly in New York on Friday. He warned that tariffs and trade disputes could plunge the world into a recession. He also said Beijing was committed to resolving these issues in a, quote, calm, rational and cooperative manner, and that China wants to be part of the global economy.
China pursues mutually beneficial cooperation. In this globalized world, countries all rise or fall together. A zero-sum mentality and beggar-thy-neighbor policy are recipes for failure. China is committed to fostering an open world economy and upholding the WTO-centered multilateral trading regime. It is committed to making globalization more open, inclusive, balanced, and beneficial to all.
To talk about all of this, we welcome from Beijing Qinduo Xu. He is a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution. Here from New York, Robert Hormats is the vice chairman of the international consulting firm Kissinger Associates. Joining us from our studios in Washington, D.C., Saruhan Hatipoglu is CGTN's global economics analyst. And right here with me at the United Nations, Wang Guan is the chief correspondent for CGTN America's Mandarin Service. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Wang Guan, let's start right here in New York. Listening to that speech there by the State Councilor Wang Yi, it could not have been more different from the one that Donald Trump made earlier this week. You know, Donald Trump talked about nationalism and national sovereignty and America first. And today we had the Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister extolling a very different view, talking about globalization and a multilateral order. What did you make of it?
Exactly, Anand. Foreign Minister and State Councilor Wang Yi rejected going it alone style unilateralism. He rejected maximum pressure campaigns through sanctions. He also rejected coercing trading partners into agreements. He was like, basically, look, China did not just talk the talk, but they walk the walk. He looked back on China in the past 70 years, how China got to where it is today, through opening up, through reforms, through embracing globalization. For example, China today is the largest trading nation in the world, largest exporter, second largest importer, second largest destination of foreign direct investment. If China had not practiced what they preached about the globalization and opening up, how could China achieve what they achieved today? He also emphasized the importance of upholding multilateralism in a global context. He pledged more support for the building of institutions such as the United Nations, pledged more support for UN troops, more funding, paying membership dues of the United Nations, and also talked about the peace. Peace is not just about stopping wars, it's about development, developing the economy. So he said China will continue to support nations through its Belt and Road Initiative, more poverty reduction campaigns throughout the world. So yes, it's a comprehensive speech. It is a speech that offered a vision that sounds pretty different from that offered by President Trump.
All right, let's go to Robert Hormats. He's in New York. Robert, listening to the speech, and if you listen to what the State Councilor had to say on issues of globalism, I mean, he also talked about other issues. He talked about the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula, Afghanistan, arms control. I mean, would it be fair to say that this was a speech that was directed at the White House?
Well, I think it was directed at the White House, but I think it was also directed at the membership of the UN, because I think State Councilor Wang Yi was trying to make a point that China wants to play a global leadership role and wants to support multilateral institutions and utilize those institutions as vehicles for expanding its leadership role, for taking a greater set of initiatives on a wide range of things. So it was really a double message. But I think the point that you're getting at is that the president's speech, President Trump's speech, really did talk a lot about nationalism and looking after your own country first. And the danger with that is that we've tried that in the world. We tried that in the 1920s, and that didn't work out so well. If we have an epidemic of disease, if we have a financial crisis, if we have a world downturn, it's critically, and many other things in dealing with environmental issues, they cannot be solved by each nation just looking after its own interest. They have to have an enlightened sense of their national interest, and an enlightened sense of your national interest today is to work with other countries, because almost none of these problems can be solved alone. And if we do get into a big confrontation or disengagement types of confrontations that are talked about frequently, it's a formula for mutually assured disruption of both China and the U.S., but also other countries. So we need to work together to deal with these problems in a rational, calm, and thoughtful way, looking toward the future, not in an inward-looking way, which is not going to answer any of the questions or deal with any of the problems.
All right, let me bring in Qinduo Xu. He's in Beijing. Qinduo Xu, during that speech, the State Councilor Wang Yi, he was very pointed and direct and used very tough language. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
Let me make it very clear. China is a country with a 5,000-year civilization, 1.4 billion hardworking and courageous people, and a vast land of 9.6 million square kilometers. China would not ever be cowed by threats or subdued by pressure.
Qinduo, what are your thoughts on what the State Councilor had to say on Friday?
Well, I think it refers obviously the current relationship between China and the United States, in particular in the trade relationship. We know the friction, the trade war between the two countries. And for the U.S. government, obviously, because the U.S. is in a position of strength. It has the largest economy. It is the most powerful country. And it is using that advantageous position to pressure China into submission, to give more concession. And I think for China, China stressed very much about the negotiation, that is equality and for rules and also for the guidance to reach a deal. So basically the message is like, no, it is impossible to pursue that kind of a goal by pressuring China into submission because of, this is a large country. 1.4 billion people. It's the second largest economy, and also its retail market is expected to become the largest this year or next year. So China has its strength to sustain its economic growth at a higher speed or at a lower speed. It will continue to grow despite all the pressure from the U.S. I think it basically said that let's sit down and reach a deal on equal terms. He also said previously about the principle China seeks to deal with the U.S. in terms of a trade negotiation. To be calm, to be rational, to be cooperative. At the same time, China will be demonstrating the maximum patience in order to reach a deal. And I think that's a message here.
Qinduo, as Robert Hormats pointed out, this was also a speech at a World Forum here at the United Nations General Assembly that was also addressed to scores of other countries that are here. How concerned should the world be that the world's biggest economy, the most powerful country, the United States, and the second biggest economy, China, have very different outlooks or approaches to the future?
Well, it is a problem, probably. This is the focus or the attention of the whole world, because if there is no stable relationship between the two largest economies, you can see a lot of countries like in the middle power of smaller countries, they would face this uncertainty. They would face this very difficult task sometimes. They are not sure whether they should choose a side, whether they are going to side with the U.S. or side with China. If you follow the U.S. approach, sometimes you would see like, oh, you are expected to be on our side against China. But look, for countries like Australia, WTO reform and the continuation of a free trading system is in their interests. Most of the countries are pursuing multilateralism. They would love the continuation of a free trade because that's in their interests. And if there is a somehow like a binary world, you have to choose between one or the other. That would create a lot of uncertainty, a lot of difficulties for the whole world. and the global market, the confidence will be weakened. And that is why you see this kind of a pessimism whenever there's bad news in terms of the trade negotiation. But I think it requires both sides, in particular the U.S. side, because the U.S., remember, the tariffs and or the trade war was launched by the U.S. side for whatever reasons. So I think the U.S. side has the onus is on the U.S. side to really create this certainty and a stable relationship, not only with China, but also with other partners too.
Yeah, you mentioned trade war. Let's go to Washington to Saruhan Hatipoglu. Saruhan, great to have you with us this evening. The State Councilor Wang Yi, one of the things he said was that unilateralism and protectionism are posing major threats to the world order. Erecting walls will not solve global challenges. Let's listen to more of what he had to say on that.
Facing the headwinds of protectionism, we should not just stand idly by. Erecting walls will not resolve global challenges, and blaming others for one's own problems does not work. The lessons of the Great Depression should not be forgotten. Tariffs and provocation of trade disputes, which upset global industrial and supply chains, serve to undermine the multilateral trading regime and global economic and trade order. They may even plunge the world into recession.
What did you make of that, Saruhan?
Well, I think the message was clear, Anand. We are slowing down in the globe. I don't think anybody can argue against that. We're slowing in the United States. We're slowing in China. We have slowed quite a bit in Europe. So the reason that we're seeing this is partly cyclical, but also some of the doings that we've seen in international economic policy, namely tariffs. Robert mentioned earlier about 1920s. There's a lesson in that time era, but I think nowadays, if you compare it back then, we are more integrated. Supply chains are more together. They have been established. So we have been forced to change at the corporation world. A lot of the clients that I talk to tell me the same thing. They've been forced to reconsider, forced to change the supply chains. The uncertainty is there. Investors, as you know, like taking risk, but when there's uncertainty, then it becomes a big issue for the global economy. So that's the business side. The 4%, 5% growth promises that we heard in the United States did not materialize because corporations are not investing. But it is not only the corporations. If you looked at the data today, I know 1 month data does not make a trend, but the consumer spending is also slowing down now. So if we go further with the other tariffs being implemented, we may have been hitting the only pillar, really, that's standing right now that is providing economic growth to the U.S., as well as the global uncertainties affecting other countries in the world.
All right, Wang Guan, I want to get to some of the specifics in the speech. And one of the things that struck me was when the State Councilor talked about the INF Treaty, that's the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is all but collapsed. That's a treaty between the United States and Russia. He mentioned that, and then he said, look, China is opposed to the deployment of these kinds of missiles in the Asia-Pacific region. And that was a reference, I'm guessing, to what the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said just a few weeks ago, in which he said, look, we'd like to deploy these missiles in Asia sooner rather than later.
Exactly. I think there has long been a concern of China containment theory by Beijing. Ever since President Obama announced this pivot to Asia, strategists and policymakers in Beijing have been worried about this. Is this pivot to Asia targeting a rising China? Does that mean a China containment theory? But now it looks like all indications point to the likelihood that this prophecy is becoming a reality. So what Wang Yi said was that China is a principled country. China is a country with pride. So if the U.S. deploys those missiles around China, seeks containment of China, China will have to retaliate. But what Wang Yi did not say is that there are different opinions inside China. There are hawkish generals. There are hardliners of military strategists who have different opinions. So if America was to deploy those missiles, that just gives more ammunition for the hardliners in China to seek more confrontational, more aggressive policies against the U.S. So that will make the jobs of Wang Yi and other diplomats difficult.
Right.
who wanted a more friendly relations
Okay,
with the U.S.
let me go to Robert Hormats on this particular issue. Robert, did it surprise you that this was in the speech?
Well, I'm not an expert on the INF, but I would like to take it to a different dimension, which is the notion of economic containment, which is another thing that has been discussed. And there are those who have this notion, and some of them are in high places in our own country here, who think that they can use a sort of Cold War playbook and try to contain China economically. To me, this underscores the point that was just made, and it was made a little while ago as well. There's a much more interdependent world today, and the notion of trying to contain China economically that some people nurture in this country is not possible. It's not a very good idea. It's certainly not a very realistic idea, but it's not really possible in as much as many of the major American trading partners trade more with China than they do with the United States, or at least as much. This is not like the Cold War where you had one group of countries that were sort of self-contained, another self-contained. This is a very integrated world, and disrupting supply chains or trying to ask one country, either you're with us or against us, you have to support the United States and not trade as much with China. That is a strategy that simply is not realistic today. It's much too interdependent a world, and we benefit enormously from that interdependence. So I think this notion of economic containment, or this notion of dividing the world up into a sort of an American-centered world and a China-centered world, this notion of disengagement, really is not a workable proposition. And I think Wang Yi, State Councilor Wang Yi, was really trying to make that point as well. Don't ask countries to choose between the two. Countries like Australia, which was mentioned, trades a lot with China, trades a lot with the United States. It doesn't want to have to make that choice, nor do most other countries in Asia or any other part of the world. So we have to really be very careful and understand it's a more integrated world. Trying to divide it up and have notions of containment are, A, it's not a good idea, B, it's certainly not realistic, and 3, it would be very disruptive.
All right, Qinduo Xu, before I move on to some of the other issues in that speech, I just want to get your view on what the State Councilor said about the INF Treaty and the fact that he was very clear about this. China is opposed to the deployment of those land-based missiles anywhere in the Asia-Pacific region. Qinduo, did you get that?
Yes, sorry. I get that the issue is like, I think not only in China, but also other regional powers, regional countries share this similar concern. That is, if there's a deployment of these intermediate missiles in, like in Asian countries, for example, in Australia, Japan, or Southeast Asian countries, or South Korea, remember, obviously that's China, which is targeted under such a system, and China will be forced to be prepared to retaliate not only at the missiles but also at the country where this missile is to be deployed. So that's the reason why Australia said no to the U.S. suggestion to deploy missiles in their territory. And I don't think Japan or South Korea are ready to accept that kind of military system. No, I don't think any Southeast Asian countries will also accept that kind of deployment. Because for those countries in this region, I think the priority is really about stability and development, economic management, economic prosperity for their own country. That's a priority. I don't think any country would love to see the situation getting worse in terms of security. They don't see the necessity to deploy such a system, like to contain China or to target China.
Saruhan, I'm going to get to something that actually, some news we had late on Friday. The Trump administration announced that it is considering a block on all U.S. investments in China. Do you think that's a threat, just a threat, a bit of leverage ahead of these trade talks that are taking place, or could we see that happen?
The latter part of it, I don't see that happening. The reason for that is we just talked about integration. We just talked about how supply chains are integrated in the business side of it. In financial market, we're even more integrated. We have about 150, 155 Chinese companies listed in the U.S. stock market here with a market valuation of $1.2 trillion. And that doesn't even include the Hong Kong side of it. If you bring those companies in there, we're about more than 200, close to 225 companies listed here. So it is kind of a leverage the president is using. It's a tactic. I don't get it, because you just got a date again to meet, to talk about progress, and then this comes as a shock to the system, and not only the Chinese system here too. When that announcement was made, I think Bloomberg revealed that there was an immediate downturn in the stock market, which was doing okay. Later on, it kind of gathered back because I think the investors are also thinking that this is not likely to happen. However, the threat is there, and again, because of this integration, I think if the president is trying to show, or the American side here is trying to show that they're playing poker, I think we need to remember that we have a couple of twos in our hands, and that's not a good gamble to make. Having said that, there could be some actually coming together on this, because the main problem with this is the accounting standards, the difference in accounting standards. The U.S. has a right to say to China, look, we're allowing Alibaba, Baidu to come and list here, but we're not given the same access in China, so that needs to change. And the accounting standards actually have to be, or principles have to be standardized to our way of looking at things if these companies are listed in the United States. So that does make sense. However, delisting and limiting portfolio inflows into China are terrible things, and I hope they don't materialize.
Yeah, let me get Robert's view on that. Robert, one of the other things State Councilor Wang Yi said was that the international order needs to go by laws and rules, and acts in violation of international norms can only plunge the world into chaos. What did you make of this announcement late on Friday from the White House saying that, well, they might block investments?
Well, I very much agree with the point that it would not be a good idea at all. I mean, I think there is a legitimate debate on some details on accounting and things like that. And that discussion has been going on for several years. We have other countries also who list and don't use exactly the same accounting standards as we do, and we work out some mutuality there. This is not an unusual situation. It happens with other countries also. And the question is to try to work them out in such a way that the investor has transparency and can understand the risks he or she is taking in buying another country's shares, and there's some comparability of statistics. But the notion of delisting or forcing the delisting of Chinese shares really in a world of an integrated financial system really does not make any sense. There are no international rules on this exactly, but there are general protocols on who can list and what terms they can list under. There are a lot of cross-listings all across the world. That enables investors to have more choices, enables that people who are raising money can list and raise capital in various markets. That's a global financial world. And this, to me, really represents a danger. I think it's more of a threat than a reality, but you never know. And there are probably some people who think that it's a strong leverage point. It would be very disruptive to do, because a lot of Americans own Chinese shares that they bought here. But don't forget, Americans who want to buy Chinese shares can buy them in other countries as well. Right. So delisting is, first of all, would be counterproductive and not a good idea. Second, if Americans wanted to buy Chinese shares, they could buy them in third country markets where they're listed. It's a global world, and we shouldn't try to pretend that it isn't, or go backwards and force delistings. It's not a good idea at all. Okay. But don't forget, there are probably some people who think it is. I don't. A lot of people on Wall Street don't, but there are probably some people who think maybe it's a point of leverage. So I worry about that.
Yeah. Wang Guan, we've been talking a lot about trade, a lot about economic relations, but let's talk about some of the political aspects of State Councilor Wang Yi's speech. He talked about the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. Let's listen.
Regarding the Korean Peninsula, the opportunity for the settlement, political settlement must not be missed again. The zigzag course over the past 20 years or so shows time and again that the realistic and viable way forward is to promote parallel progress in denuclearization and the establishment of a peace mechanism to accommodate the concerns of all sides and gradually build trust through phased and synchronized actions. The DPRK has demonstrated a readiness to promote dialogue. It is hoped that the U.S. can meet the DPRK halfway.
So he said that he hopes that the U.S. can meet the DPRK halfway. What's halfway?
Well, I think China has been very clear that there should be the so-called phased yet synchronized steps taken by both sides, meaning the U.S. should take sanctions off the table that is really punishing the people of North Korea, the DPRK. And at the same time, the DPRK should be careful, should be very careful in conducting nuclear testing, should take the nuclear testings off the table as well. So I think China has been very consistent. There is a continuity and consistency in China's foreign policy proposals when it comes to not only the DPRK, but also Iran, Afghanistan, and other hotspot issues. That is, you need to come together, come to negotiation table. Wang Yi also said that the JCPOA, the withdrawal of the JCPOA was a big mistake, and the nation states should come to the table, consult with each other, because by walking out of the treaty unilaterally really is harmful for all sides.
Yeah, in fact, he did say in his speech he wants that back on track.
Right.
Right. Qinduo Xu, one final point from New York, and that is when you listen to the speech, when you look at it in its entirety, what was the broad message that Wang Yi was bringing to the world here?
Sorry, your question, please?
Question is, what was the broad message when you look at the entirety of the speech? What was the broad message that he was bringing to the United Nations, effectively to the world?
Yes, I think the key message here is like he tries to present China as explaining the Chinese foreign diplomacy, basically the policy, foreign policy, for example, is a peaceful development, which is written in the Chinese institution. China is following a peaceful, let's say the rise of China is peaceful, and also China does not and has never to seek hegemony or seek expansion. And I think China has made a very consistent, this is not the first time it makes it clear to the world. And also things like that, I think stress very much about multilateralism, stress very much about the cooperation.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Wang Guan, it's been great having you with me here at the United Nations in New York. Of course, we're coming to the end of the week where we've heard all these leaders. Great to have you here, and thanks to all our guests in Washington, in Beijing, and in New York as well. That's it for this special edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu from the United Nations. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.